Howdy, everybody. Welcome to Highly Questionable Marketing. Jurgen, I'm just going to pass it to you. Why don't you kick this off? We're going to talk some revenue. Revenue. I don't know if I'm saying it right. Revenue. Wait, some people say like reveting, I think, too.
That's great.
That's their new way of adding revenue and marketing. Reveting.
So in 2022, the word on every B2B marketer's lips was revenue, right? And it will continue in 2023. It will be what everybody's obsessed with. Now, here's what's interesting. It is suggested that there are some relatively straightforward scientific things that marketing teams and organizations can, just follow and do to, get the kind of revenue. Hasn't this always been the promise, right? Several years ago, it was predictable revenue. And the way to get predictable revenue was largely through hiring an army of SDRs and doing it, like you just look at the spreadsheets and you have these numbers and you add this and then you just get, Now it's just like, well, because it's so easy to create demand, etc., you can also just generate revenue, right? And so here's how you do that. And what's really happening is that we're making two mistakes in one. One is we are talking about revenue as if that is like the purpose of marketing. That's what it's all about, And number two, we are obsessing over an outcome. We are not obsessing over a discipline, a rigor, input, quality, strategy, thought. Like, we are not obsessing over that. We're just obsessing over like what comes out at the other end, revenue. Let's get more of it. And this thing about like whatever you want to call it, right? Like it's just new words, I'm sorry, guys. Largely it is new words on same shit. Largely, not entirely, but largely. And so it is what has always been this thing in B2B marketing land, which is just like, well, you do stuff, and then you see what's working. And then you're learning about that. And then you do more of the stuff that's working. And guess what you do with the stuff that's not working, Jay? You stop doing it. Whew, I'll be damned. Yeah, you just stop that and then do more of what works. And then when you need to, start something else that you can do. And then look for the signals of how that's working. Run it through some stages, if you will. Apply a little bit more data-drivenness to it. And all of a sudden, you have it figured out. This is how you can now get all the revenue that your heart desires, right? Meanwhile, all marketing teams are going to be challenged like crazy in 2023. And people are going to continue to say, well, you're not getting the demand or now the revenue that you want because you're not doing the right things. You're not running the right tactics. You may not be smart enough to think about it that way. And so shame on you, Mr. Marketer. And that is just the wrong conversation to have about how we're going to make things better.
Yeah. Yeah. We keep hearing, right? Like there's this scientific approach now to revenue. You start running experiments. You will generate some positive signals as a marketing team, revenue team, whatever. I actually like more to revenue teams and marketing teams, I feel now as I kind of read some messaging. But, right, you're going to generate positive signals so that you can go to your CFO, right, and say, well, look, we've generated some demos now and a little bit of pipeline. So, like, we're going to need a few more quarters on this to really prove it out, right? And you're putting your eggs in that basket, I feel like, to drive revenue. And it is, as I, in my humble opinion, break it down, it is a regurgitation of the fall struggle in something that sounds really cool now, which is we are going to tackle revenue scientifically and run experiments around revenue generating programs so that everybody knows what's working and what's not. And then you can report that data to your CFO and your board and your executive team to show the positive signals that you're generating right up until you find that one signal and you're going to triple down on it and you're going to generate all this revenue. And I still think we're fucking talking about tactics, in my humble opinion, number one. is everything I see around this idea of scientific approach is they are running ads. Maybe they're creating content. Maybe they're creating some landing pages and things like that. Maybe they're experimenting with different channels to drive revenue, but it still sounds like you're doing all this different shit that we talk about as the biggest challenge to your marketing team to try to find a revenue program that you can scale. And I just want to get on record going into 2023. I think that it's going to take a few quarters, but I think this is going to backfire on marketers that buy into this actually.
Yeah, I mean, if the marketing profession is going to live on and thrive and all that stuff. And some might say that that isn't really what we're trying to do here. You know, some might want a different kind of a change around the very function. Okay, so be it. But for the rest of us, you know, who really are real marketers who've been doing this for years and years and who have love for other marketers and support and want to be an ally to marketers, I just would think about the whole thing differently. I would just think about, how can I have the greatest impact on the business? What can I do? What can I go deep on that will actually make it so that the business is in a fundamentally different place? And obsessing over these like scientific ways to drive revenue, sure, that is one thing that helps companies, and you could argue that in 2023, that's more important than ever because revenue is going to be harder and harder to come by. But it ends up being short-term band-aids, you know? Like, why are we talking about revenue when we really need to talk about growth and the right kind of growth?
It's all about revenue, Jürgen. Don't you know
and
that?
pipeline. Don't forget about pipeline. I love pipeline.
Yeah. I'm going to throw you a pipeline. Right? Like, so I want to talk about just a few, at least challenges I see under a scientific approach for revenue, because the first thing my mind goes to is you're going to get all this data to support that program that's going to drive sustainable and scalable revenue for you. And if you are not, in my opinion, probably Series C or D right now, and you're not already driving considerable amounts of data and volume, and I'm talking probably hundreds of demos coming into your site, which then correlates into a ton of opportunities and things like that, right? This idea that you're going to scientifically figure this out with the outcome of revenue based on data is the biggest scam that I can know of, because the data will never be enough to be relevant. You're going to spend that time looking at data to support your cause, and it will never be enough data. And as soon as you try to scale it because you think you have enough, that shit's not going to scale, because I firmly believe, like I said, it's just that false struggle. People don't realize that they're still kind of optimizing tactics, but it sounds really cool when you're like, no, we are running ads on the category to validate TikTok as a growth lever for us. And we're going to get data to support that and have enough data that we're going to know to sustain and scale it to next year.
Yeah, when you put it that way, you know, we are supposed to try new things. We are supposed to investigate what can be figured out and what can improve the situation. We are supposed to work on incrementally important stuff. And we can't just sit there and think about these big exponential kind of bets. So sure, like there is something fair about just the premise here, which is, yeah, you can't like not try to do things that bring in revenue. I guess the question really is, to your point about data, can you actually really get there? You know, for most companies, is it realistic that a set of programs will be given enough oxygen to last long enough to give you enough data to make the kind of decisions that you need to make smartly, or are you still in this world of kind of like trying and sort of kind of proving that it's working or not working and making a decision off of that? Because I think my experience, right, is that most of the time you either make the decision that, hey, this is working, we're going to keep doing it because we believe that it's working, and we aren't being as objective as we even want to be because we don't have enough data and we don't have enough time to figure that out. Or on the other side of it, we're just like, you know what, that didn't really seem to work, did it? Well, we did it actually because the CEO was kind of suggesting it, or the sales leader. So we kind of tried, and now we can say we tried. And so like that doesn't work. So like, in most cases, look, I'm sorry, I'm just a regular marketer, you know, I'm nothing great here.
Yeah.
But in most cases, you keep hopping around and you try these things, and in the end, it isn't that scientific of a method.
The data lens and kind of what you were asking me a little bit is like, can you get enough data, right? And not when you're focused on the outcome of revenue, right? I mean, most companies are the typical company, right? And I'm talking Series A, Series B, they're not closing hundreds of deals a quarter. Let's be real, right? They're closing maybe a few dozen a quarter in the typical B2B SaaS company, transparently. In the average 5, 10, 20 million, they're not closing hundreds, right? So this idea that your marketing is going to have enough to find something sustainable to the pure outcome of revenue is ridiculous, number one. And that's where I've said, at least, that's what your marketing team cannot focus and optimize around revenue. Period.
Yep.
End of discussion. Unless you are in high growth, you are crushing it. You know the lever, right? And I'll talk on one more thing and I'll let you go too, which is you kind of like, what do people do, right? I got this inkling, this kind of working. I'm gonna go do this over here now, right? So that's where the data becomes another issue from what I'm getting is like, well, we're gonna run these 3, 4, or 5 things instead of where it's like, no, we're gonna focus on this one opportunity so we can get the data that we need and the learnings and things like that by not spreading out across several opportunities. Now, those learnings are not going to be revenue focused, right? The signal idea is right, but it tries to make it too prescriptive, which is they're always looking for a certain signal instead of looking for why they're running the experiment and what they're hoping to learn from that experiment specifically on their path toward sustainable growth. All they're trying to learn about is revenue.
Yeah. Yeah, like in the truest sense of the word optimize, like optimizing for revenue is one hell of a task. You know, that takes time, resources, data that you don't have. So being revenue obsessed is all well and good, but you can't actually truly optimize for revenue. Which brings me to the other thing I wanted to share, which is, in fairness, there are people out beating the revenue drum that is saying, yeah, you're oriented and sort of obsessing about revenue and, you know, revenue programs and stuff like that, but you're optimizing for pipeline, right? So that's where pipeline comes in. Just to give that side some credit here, you know, because I talk a lot of shit. So if you're saying, no, we are going to measure, first of all, we're going to define and measure pipeline a certain way. And then we are going to have confidence that that pipeline actually turns into this level of revenue, you know, give or take, whatever. Then yes, you're shortcutting it a little bit and making it a little more feasible to say like, okay, it's not going to take quite as long. But I have a feeling you have a clear opinion about why that also is not the winning formula. Like that isn't enough, right?
No, this is, I cannot believe we're actually having this conversation that people have really boiled down marketing like this, in my opinion now. 2 years ago, I would have actually thought this was great, by the way. So like I have completely shifted my stance on this. And I think you brought up another point too, which is the time game, right? So a lot of marketers don't have the time to focus on the outcome to get to something sustainable. So they start focusing on pipeline. one, you still run into the same issue. How many times do we generate pipeline and it takes to the end of the fucking quarter for them all to go close lost anyways, right? Like that's typically what I see happening at most. The typical B2B SaaS company that has, some of the political bullshit and everything else. That's always what happens, right? So you optimize around pipeline or SQOs and opportunities, and you still get to the same issue, which is you're still too focused on the outcomes of what great marketing is, when you should be focusing on what will drive great marketing and how do I measure that my marketing is great, right? I actually still like the idea of this signal mentality, but it's still even too focused on, I think, the outcomes, right? From my understanding, it's like it's inbounds. Are we getting inbounds? And then are we getting pipeline? And then are we getting revenue, right? Well, if you go through those stages, let's say you start going through inbounds. Okay, let's talk about the time component a little bit. It's going to take you, in a typical B2B SaaS company that's selling to the mid-market enterprise, right? Take you a quarter or two to show some signals around that probably. I think that's fair, right? And then you're going to go a quarter or two to get to pipeline, right? And then you're going to go a quarter or two to validate to revenue, right? You just went 6 quarters. By the way, you don't even know if this shit scales yet. You have no idea. And what's going to happen is after those quarters, you're going to try to scale it. And I can bet you every dollar I got. Maybe not a lot of dollars, but I'll bet you that's just not going to scale because the experiments are on a failed premise. They're not attacking sustainable growth around a growth hypothesis. They lack focus. They're sometimes looking for the wrong signals because they're trying to standardize the signals that you're going after instead of looking at it holistically in terms of what's our product, what's our life cycle, what's our challenge, what's our channel, where's our opportunity, what experiments do I need to run based on the constraints and the opportunities. All this shit is too prescriptive for a B2B company to go out and do, because it's going to be different for every B2B company. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't have a framework and systems to run experiments, right? But you can't standardize metrics to pipeline and revenue. That's going to be the trap for everybody. I am all on board on running meaningful, impactful experiments with focus in the name of sustainable growth, right? But that is a different game than trying to optimize around revenue, especially early on, to drive growth, in my opinion.
Yeah. So I guess it leads us to what you're alluding to here is that there is a difference between, on one hand, optimizing for revenue, and on the other hand, being oriented around sustainable growth. Those are two totally different kind of, almost philosophical approaches to B2B marketing at this point. And I know you well enough to know that you come down pretty clearly on the, orienting around sustainable growth. I think there's no secret that you have, some ideas that might be more meaningful for marketers to think about other than just a scientific approach to generating as much revenue as you can, so without the purpose of this wasn't to have it all build up to you give this grand pitch about, well,
no, it is not.
But I do think that it is worth paying off, this conversation with what is really a different way to think about it. Because look, everybody is going to feel the pressure to contribute more and more to revenue, throughout this this season that we're in, right? So it's not that B2B marketers can just skirt the issue altogether and just sorry, CEO, I just don't really believe in this kind of way to getting revenue. So I'll just sit over here and just, I don't know, think of some other cool stuff. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about just a different way of trying to get the same thing, but in a different way.
So again, right? And I mean real marketing practitioners out of the bubble. And there's just, I'm not trying to sell some bullshit service or anything, by the way. I'm just attacking this as a marketing practitioner who has watched all this unfold, I think, over the last few years, right? Which is, Is your marketing team focusing on revenue? Is that making you a better marketing team? Are you doing better marketing because of it? Are you doing marketing that's going to differentiate you? Are you actually doing marketing that you think will sustain and scale? I think if you asked 99% of marketing leaders and they were being honest, they would tell you no, right? And the answer isn't, well, we need a scientific approach. The answer is it's the wrong KPI for marketing. It's just the wrong KPI. Now, I don't want to sit there and say marketing is responsible partially for the growth of a company, 100%, and they must drive growth, which does show itself in a revenue number. We're talking about fundamentally optimizing your marketing around revenue and pipeline. That's the big distinction to me in this. We're not saying that marketing doesn't or shouldn't be liable to drive growth and revenue at some point, 100%. We're talking about using that as the main KPI to measure if your marketing is successful or not.
Yeah.
And that's the distinction. I don't believe it's leading you to doing better, more impactful marketing because you are now focused on revenue. In fact, you've helped me realize that defense thing, it pushes you to defense and you never realize it because now you're just trying to justify everything that you're doing in the name of revenue. And I want to say one more thing and I'll pass it off to you quickly. I believe 100% if a marketing agency at least is coming in talking to you about revenue and justifying revenue and revenue experiments, they're doing one of two things in my opinion. They are gambling with your growth, which is they don't know what's going to work, but they're running experiments based under the idea that they're going to generate revenue. Okay. Two, they're just scaling something that already works. They're taking something that already works and they're just scaling that. That's what I believe happens if that's what you go down. There is a methodical approach to it, but it's not about focusing on the outcome of revenue. And that's just kind of my belief with this.
Whenever you open your mouth about revenue and it's not what everybody else is saying, it's not about like, well, I'm a revenue obsessed marketer, I'm a revenue first marketer. Whenever it's not that and you kind of question it, I think like you run the risk of being laughed out the room. But the distinction you made is really helpful, which is it's not about believing that you shouldn't ultimately have your marketing generate revenue. It's not that we're not believing that. We're not believing that using the metric revenue and even pipeline allows you to optimize your marketing in the optimal way. Like that's the problem, is that yeah, you can optimize for pipeline at least, and if you have years and years you can optimize for revenue too, but that isn't creating the optimal marketing to drive the most revenue over time. And I think that's what we just want to impart on people. So no matter what the approach is, if it's like super scientific or like, yeah, like we're really like, we have this specific way that we do it, like it's still the same issue, which is you're optimizing inappropriately.
There is a reason I have noticed some of the big name consultants and agencies. What do they really say they work with? High growth B2B SaaS. And there's a reason for that. It's not because they're coming in and changing the game for them. It's actually what I just said, which you made me just think about further. They're just scaling what works there. There's a lot of allure to being an agency in a high growth SaaS already. They already have programs that are working, and you can come in and be an additive and fuel to those programs, right? And then they're convincing everybody else, well, we have all of this data now across all of these customers, and we're going to use that for you. And that's the missing unlock in some of this. And again, I will just go back and say one thing. Your product's different. Your life cycle's different. Your customers are different. Your channels are different. None of that shit matters. Unless the data is direct competitors, the data means nothing. It doesn't matter how you're doing against other B2B companies. It means nothing. And you just need to realize that.